If some feature has disappeared from the faces of the parents, why is it that, after a quiet interval of time, it can return upon the face of a child? If something that seems to have dissolved into oblivion still remains silently somewhere within life, then who is the one who has kept it safe? Who is the one who has placed those invisible designs inside a tiny seed, so that in some season it may awaken again? Tonight, in the slow and gentle atmosphere of deep sleep of power, we will enter the story of Gregor Mendel, a man who did not live amid the thunder of imperial hoofbeats, did not stand upon the high platforms of noisy public squares, and did not enter history in the form of a conqueror. He lived far more quietly. He was a monk, a gardener, a patient man standing among rows of green pea plants beneath the pale light of early morning, asking questions that most of the world at that time did not yet know how to hear. Picture a monastery garden in Brno. The early dew still clings to the leaves. The stillness is so complete that one can almost hear the wind brushing softly against the fence, the earth breathing beneath one's feet, the faint sound of a small flower unfolding slowly in the tender sunlight. Pea vines climb their trellises, so ordinary that they are nearly invisible. No one looking at them would imagine that here, one of the greatest secrets of life lay quietly at rest. No one would think that from those small flowers, those peas, round, wrinkled, green, yellow, a man would gradually open the door to an entirely new branch of science. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about Mendel is not that he saw greatness in small things. It is that he was slow enough to remain with those small things longer than others. In a world always carried away by louder noises, he chose to trust in what was quiet. He did not force nature to speak more quickly. He waited, he counted, he recorded. He allowed the laws of life to reveal themselves in their own time. Gently and unhurriedly, like the moon slowly emerging from behind the clouds. And for that reason, Mendel's story is a story especially suited to this very hour, when the room is gradually growing quieter, when the breath can slow, when we no longer need anything sensational, but only a small lamp, a steady voice, and a life deep enough to carry the mind far away, while still allowing the heart to rest. If you love stories like these, stories in which knowledge walks hand in hand with stillness, then gently subscribe to Deep Sleep of Power to continue accompanying us through nights that are softer, slower, and richer in reflection. For tonight, from that garden, from those pea vines that seem to have almost nothing to tell, we will trace the footsteps of a man who was able to read what lay sleeping inside the seed. But before there was that garden, before there were numbers, crossbreeding experiments, and quiet laws that would change the way humanity understood life, there was once a boy who grew up very close to the earth. So close that perhaps it was the earth itself, the rain itself, the seasons themselves, that taught him his very first lesson in the patience of nature. Before he became the man who could read the laws sleeping quietly inside seeds, Gregor Mendel had first been a child of the fields, a child born not among great libraries, not within the stone walls of prestigious academies, but within the slow rhythm of a peasant family in Moravia. There, life was not measured by the bells of public lectures, but by sowing season and harvest season, by rains that came on time or a few days too late, by whether the soil was willing to open itself to the seed or not. Mendel's childhood, therefore, carried the scent of wet grass, dry straw, freshly turned earth, orchards and hands at work from early morning until the evening light began to thin. His family was not wealthy. Like so many peasant families of that century, they lived closer to diligence than to abundance. Every harvest was a hope entrusted to the earth, and at the same time a quiet anxiety, for all it took was a change in the weather's mood for so much labor to suddenly become fragile. It was within that world that young Gregor learned his first lessons without yet needing to name them. He learned that nature never speaks too loudly. A seed does not sprout in the middle of a great noise. A tender leaf does not unfurl simply because someone is impatient. Everything alive has its own rhythm, a rhythm that is slow, discreet, almost humble. Perhaps from a very early age, Mendel absorbed this truth without knowing it, that to understand life, one must first know how to wait. People often remember him as a scientist of numbers, crossings, and laws. But before those numbers, there was a little boy standing quietly among the orchard trees, watching the color of leaves change with the seasons, watching branches blossom and then bear fruit, watching similarities and differences repeat themselves year after year. In that childhood, nature had not yet appeared as a problem to be solved. It appeared as a wordless book, and Mendel, with a very gentle instinct, had already begun learning how to read from its first pages. There is something deeply beautiful about people who grow up close to the earth. They often understand early that life is never simple, no matter how ordinary it may appear from the outside. A single grain of rice can sustain an entire season. A frail young sprout can become shade for many years to come. A shift in the wind can bend an entire field. When one lives among such things, one gradually stops mistaking the small for the trivial. Perhaps Mendel was the same. He was raised in a world where the small always carried a quiet weight. But a poor childhood did not only teach him about the beauty of nature, it also taught him about limits. It taught him that human beings cannot waste, cannot live entirely according to desire, cannot separate themselves from the very real demands of life. In a family without abundance, education was a beautiful dream, but also a burden. Every step farther along the road of knowledge had to be paid for with labor, with thrift, with sacrifices left unspoken. For that reason, the light of intelligence in Mendel did not blossom from ease. It grew out of discipline, gratitude, and the feeling that if he wished to go farther than the fate prepared for him, he would have to walk on legs made strong by endurance. Perhaps it was also because he grew up in poverty that Mendel did not develop the noisy pride found in many learned people. In him, knowledge later did not become something to display, but something like a lamp carefully shielded from the wind. He carried with him a rare kind of humility, the humility of one who had known how hard the ground could be, how long the winter could be, and how small a human being could be before the great cycles of nature. That humility would remain with him for a very long time, entering even into the way he practiced science. Not hurried, not boastful, not demanding that nature answer at once. The world of Mendel's childhood was also a world of repetition. Dawn returned each day. Winter would pass. Bare trees would grow green again. Seeds sleeping in the soil would one morning find their hour to awaken. To many people, such repetition might seem monotonous, but to a sensitive mind, repetition is the first home of law. Perhaps young Gregor did not yet know what to call that, but he lived within it. He had already seen that nature was not only beautiful, it was also ordered. A gentle order, a discreet order, yet a durable one. And who knows? Perhaps it was precisely in those days of standing among orchards, fields, and tasks that seemed almost too ordinary to notice that another seed was also planted within him. The seed of observation. Not the kind of observation that belongs to someone merely passing by and making a remark, but the kind that belongs to someone who remains long enough to notice a very small difference between two leaves, a very slight change in the hue of a blossom, a pattern of repetition so faint it seems invisible until little by little it begins to take shape before the eyes. That childhood was not radiant in the way history usually praises. There were no glorious scenes, no support from power or privilege. There was only a boy born from the earth, raised with the earth, and quietly taught by the earth its first lessons in patience, in order, in life, and in waiting. But sometimes such beginnings are the most enduring of all. For a tree that wishes to stand for a long time, it must first send its roots deep into the place no one sees. And then the time would come when that boy would leave behind the familiar rhythms of the fields and orchards to step onto another road, narrower, harder, poorer, yet also opening toward horizons that the earth of his childhood had only just begun to whisper to him. And when the light of learning began to appear in the distance, people would see that to reach the door of knowledge, a bright mind must sometimes pass through many narrow corridors of life. There are minds that enter knowledge as though stepping through a wide open gate, beneath bright lamps, with ample books and hands ready to support them. But there are also minds that must make their way toward knowledge along another road, narrower, rougher, windier, and many times seeming as though it might have to end halfway through. The path of Gregor Mendel belonged to the second kind, not noisy, not smooth, but for that very reason, every step upon it left a deeper mark upon the soul. Born into a farming family of modest means, Mendel could not regard education as something self-evident. For him, school was not only a place to broaden the mind, but also a fragile dream that had to be protected through great effort. Nearly every year that he was able to continue his studies had to be exchanged for his family's frugality, for the quiet hopes of his parents, for hardships left unspoken. Perhaps for that reason, Mendel understood from an early age something very ordinary and yet very profound. Knowledge is precious because it does not come easily. His years of study did not carry the shining appearance of a genius discovered early. They were more like a small lamp that had to burn in the wind, at times a little brighter, at times dimmer, at times almost seeming about to go out, yet never fully willing to die. People often admire great minds because of their final achievements, but seldom pause for long before the road that such a mind had to travel with endurance. For Mendel, intelligence did not bloom amid comfort. It grew amid worry, amid material limits, amid the quiet exhaustion of a young man who understood that he did not possess much room to waste. Perhaps it was hardship itself that taught him a very quiet form of discipline. When a person has little, that person learns how to preserve. When there is little time, one learns to use it carefully. When there are few opportunities, one learns to move slowly yet steadily through each half-open door. Mendel seemed to carry that kind of discipline into his studies, not radiant in the manner of sudden brilliance, but patient like water seeping into the soil, day by day, lesson by lesson, page by page, thought by thought, all of it gathered into a strength not easily seen by the naked eye, like roots slowly pressing downward into the earth, while above ground everything still appears calm. But that road was not difficult only because of poverty. It was also difficult because the human body and spirit themselves have limits. To study in conditions of hardship is not only a matter of money, it is also a matter of pressure, of health, of a young person having to keep the mind Roshan amid the very real encirclements of life. There were times when Mendel was exhausted. There were periods when he had to struggle with weariness and strain. That makes his portrait feel closer, more human. He was not a machine that knew only how to move forward. He was a man of flesh and bone, with aspiration, but also with limits, with willpower, but also with an understanding of heaviness and uncertainty. And perhaps it is precisely here that Mendel's beauty appears most clearly, for he did not continue because of favorable circumstances. He continued because of something more deeply enduring, the endurance of one who does not wish to betray the small light he had seen from very early on. A person like that does not need to be noisy in order to be worthy of respect. Simply continuing onward, while life constantly tests one's capacity to endure, is already a very great quality. Those years of study also quietly prepared Mendel for an ability that would later become central to all of his work, the ability to endure slowness. One who is accustomed to living in want often understands that not everything precious arrives quickly. Some rewards come only after many seasons of waiting. Some doors open only after a person has knocked very gently for a very long time, without leaving too soon. Later, this would become a very important part of the way Mendel did science. He was not impatient with nature. He did not demand that answers appear at once. He knew how to stand still long enough for even the most hidden things to slowly reveal themselves. If we look more closely, we will see something deeply moving. That unsteady path of learning did not make Mendel bitter. It made him more thoughtful, more patient, more humble. There are people who, after hardship, wish only to prove themselves to the world. Mendel seemed different. He did not study in order to surpass others by speaking more loudly. He studied like a man quietly seeking a steadier place for himself within the vast order of life. Perhaps that is why, later, when he stood before the secrets of living things, he did not behave like a conqueror. He behaved like one who knew how to listen. That gives Mendel's youth a very particular kind of beauty. Not radiant, not glorious, but like a seed lying beneath a dark layer of soil, silently bearing the weight above it, in preparation for the day it will send forth a shoot. Many people see only the flower when it blooms. History often does the same. It remembers the discovery, the fame, the legacy. But beneath every great discovery, there is almost always such a quiet stretch of life. A stretch in which a person learns how to pass through poverty without losing clarity of mind, pass through weariness without losing faith, pass through narrowness while still preserving a private sky for the inner life. For Mendel, that stretch of life not only brought him closer to knowledge, it also brought him closer to himself, for there are roads that only by walking them do we understand where we belong. And sometimes, after many narrow corridors, many cramped rooms, many doors that do not fully open, a person suddenly finds a place quiet enough to breathe, steady enough to study, still enough for the deepest questions to begin growing. For Mendel, that place was waiting for him ahead, not as a radiant reward, but as a silent home where faith, knowledge, and the rhythm of daily life would gradually wind around one another like climbing vines that had finally found a trellis to hold them. There are some people who step through a doorway because of faith, and then on the other side, they find the whole destiny of their intellect as well. For Gregor Mendel, The monastery was not merely a place to stop after years of unsteady and exhausting study. It was also a pause deep enough for his soul to breathe more evenly, and a home sturdy enough that the quiet questions within him would not die prematurely amid the worries of everyday life. When Mendel entered the Augustinian monastery in Brno, perhaps he could not yet have known that this place would become the cradle of one of the most foundational discoveries of modern science. But perhaps he felt something else, something simpler, something closer. After many years of passing through the narrow roads of hardship, he had at last arrived in a space that did not require him to run too quickly. There was a steady rhythm there. There was the sound of bells marking the hours. There were cool, quiet stone corridors. There were prayers, simple meals, silences not torn into fragments by too many urgent demands. And above all, there was a rare feeling that minds long accustomed to uncertainty often recognize at once: the feeling of being anchored. Many people still imagine a monastery as a place that turns its back on the world. But for Mendel, perhaps it was more like another way of entering the world, entering its deeper, quieter, more enduring part. For that monastery did not contain only prayer and inner discipline. It also had a library, conversations, and people concerned with learning, with crops, with nature, with the subtle changes of the life around them. It was not a place noisy with fame, yet it was a place very rich in nourishment for the intellect. There, a thought could be kept long enough to mature. Sometimes, in order to travel very far into the mysteries of life, a person must enter a space almost separated from the noise of ordinary living. This may sound paradoxical, but it is deeply true in Mendel's story. If he had been forced to continue living entirely under the pressure of daily survival, perhaps he still would have been an intelligent man, a hard-working man, a decent man. But he might not have possessed the most precious thing that any great discovery requires: quiet time. Time is not only for working, but for thinking, for looking at a phenomenon longer than others do, for allowing a question to remain in the mind through many nights, many seasons, until it is no longer merely a curiosity, but becomes a path. The monastery gave Mendel that. It gave him a rhythm of life in which the mind could gradually learn how to listen more deeply. The regularity of monastic life, waking, praying, studying, working, resting, perhaps did not make him smaller, but on the contrary, created the necessary frame within which his inner strength could slowly grow. There are minds that bloom only in chaos, but there are also minds, like Mendel's, that need a kind and orderly structure around them in order to unfold fully, just as a young vine needs a trellis so that the wind will not bend it to the ground. His intellect seemed to find in the monastery a structure firm enough to continue growing. At a deeper level, the monastery also brought Mendel something that suited his very nature: humility. Not the outward kind of humility, spoken in words, but the kind that seeps into the rhythm of life itself. There, a person is reminded each day that he is not the center of the universe, that there are orders greater than himself, more enduring than himself, quieter than himself. That very awareness would later become an important quality in the way Mendel practiced science. He did not approach nature as one who demanded to conquer it. He came as a listener. He did not force it to speak at once. He did not impose hasty conclusions upon it. He simply stood near enough, long enough, calmly enough, to hear what it was whispering through its smallest changes. And perhaps it was also from this point onward that Mendel's life began to take on a very particular beauty. the beauty of a life standing at the meeting place between faith and knowledge. For many people, those two paths seem to move in opposite directions, but for him, they did not necessarily have to conflict. Both required patience. Both began by accepting that there are things greater than ourselves. Both required a mind sufficiently disciplined and a heart sufficiently humble. Mendel may never have said that in grand words, but the way he lived seems to have said it for him. A human being can bow before the sacred and at the same time open his eyes very carefully to what may be observed and measured in the visible world. And then, within those walls that seemed so secluded, another door also quietly began to open. Brno was not only a place with a monastery, it was also a small city quietly vibrating with very earthly concerns: harvests, plant varieties, livestock, yields, and improvement. Beyond the hours of prayer and study, around Mendel, there was a world slowly changing, a world in which people increasingly wanted to understand why one plant was better than another, why one breed was hardier than the next, why nature seemed to contain laws that someone, if only patient enough, might one day perceive. And like an underground stream, finally meeting the right layer of earth to carry it farther, Mendel's inner life also began to touch the broader intellectual life of the place where he now lived. From that quiet roof, he would not remain within the limits of a man who studied only in order to know. He would gradually step into a space where his personal questions would meet the larger movements of his age. Sometimes history does not wait in radiant capitals. It waits in a small city, where seeds, books, conversations, and a mind arriving at the right moment come together beneath the same windless sky. There are great ideas that are not born in noisy public squares, do not grow beneath the lights of radiant capitals, and do not need a vast stage in order to begin entering history. Sometimes they choose to take root in a far humbler place. A small city, where life moves with the steady rhythm of the seasons, of market days, of rooftops still without smoke in the early morning, and of people who do not in the least know that they are living very near a turning point in human knowledge. Brno was such a place. When Gregor Mendel entered the life of this city, Brno was not a name that made Europe turn its head because of its brilliance. It was not Paris, not Vienna, not London. It did not stand at the center of political power or scholarly fame. But perhaps precisely because it was not too noisy, not too swept up in the displays of the age, Brno preserved something rare, a degree of stillness just deep enough for the right questions to remain in the human mind for a long time. The city stood at a very particular meeting point between agricultural life and the scholarly spirit. There, people did not merely live alongside land, seasons, plants, and livestock, but were also beginning to care more deeply about improving them. A better variety of plants could change yields. A more resilient harvest could ease the burden of many families. A correct observation about nature could, very slowly yet very deeply, enter into both the meals and the daily lives of ordinary people. For that reason, in Brno, science was not entirely a distant matter confined to abstract academies. It stayed closer to the ground. It brushed against the sleeves of gardeners, farmers, beekeepers, and caretakers of orchards. It appeared as a quiet need to understand more in order to live better, and the Augustinian monastery in Brno was not a place closed off from such concerns. It was a very special space, where faith, education, libraries, dialogue, and the observation of nature coexisted under one roof. The people who lived there did not only pray, they read, they taught, they spoke about crops, about breeds of animals, about the natural world changing from season to season. In other words, the monastery did not turn its back on life. It was more like a quiet bridge stretched between reflection and reality, between what human beings believe and what human beings can measure, count, and observe. In such an environment, Mendel had almost certainly arrived in the very place meant for him. A childhood close to the soil meant that plants were not foreign to him. Years of difficult study had taught him not to treat knowledge as an ornament, but as a source of light to be carefully preserved. And the rhythm of monastic life gave him a stillness in which those two currents could meet. Brno, in a certain sense, was the place where the scattered pieces of Mendel's life began to find one another. The memory of the countryside, the patience born of hardship, the discipline of ordered living, the love of learning, and the curiosity stirred by the silent laws of nature. What was precious about Brno was that it did not force people like Mendel to become loud in order to be seen. On the contrary, it allowed that kind of intellect to develop according to its own rhythm. There are minds that truly blossom only in fiercely competitive environments where everyone must speak faster, prove earlier, publish more. But there are also minds that need a different kind of climate. The climate of patience, of long observation, of conversations not spoken too loudly, of libraries, of gardens, of repeated habits within which thought is gently kept warm. Mendel seemed to belong to the second kind. It may be said that Brno did something history rarely names aloud. It created the spiritual conditions for a great discovery. A great idea does not require only an intelligent person. It also requires an environment quiet enough that the person is not torn into fragments by countless unnecessary noises. It needs the common concerns of the age to be near enough for the question to be nourished, but also enough stillness for that question not to be pushed into becoming a hasty performance. Brno quietly held both of those things in the same palm. Looking back, we can see that a small city is something like a plot of earth that had already been turned over before anyone realized it. The conversations about agriculture, plant varieties and improvement, the monastic life with its libraries and discipline, the meeting point between practice and scholarship, all of it made this place ready ground. It did not produce the seed by itself, but it knew how to keep a seed moist once it had been placed there. And Mendel, with all his quiet perseverance, was that seed. Perhaps the most beautiful thing here is this: Brno did not try to become great. It simply fulfilled the role of a place quiet enough for great things to begin. Perhaps history is often like that. Its deepest movements do not always come from the largest places. Sometimes they come from a humble corner of life, where people remain close enough to nature to know how to bend down and look at small things, and still enough to realize that the small sometimes shelters secrets greater than empires. For Mendel, Brno was not only a place to live, it was an atmosphere, a state of being, a quiet embrace holding his mind in the period when his questions were still asking for a clearer form. But then, like a stream that has finally found its riverbed, that intellect still needed to travel a little farther in order to learn how to measure more precisely the things it already sensed. For curiosity, if it is nourished long enough, it will not be content merely to stand and look at the world in silence. At some point, it will want to learn the language of numbers, of measurement, of rules that can make intuition grow clear. As though a window has just been cleaned a little more thoroughly, so that the light outside may enter the room a little deeper. There are stages in life that do not change a person with the sound of thunder, but through a very gentle adjustment of the gaze. Before arriving in Vienna, Gregor Mendel already carried within him a love for nature, the patience of a farmer's son, and the ability to stand still before small things without growing weary. But in Vienna, those qualities began to meet something newer, sharper, more precise, the language of science, of mathematics, of measurement. If childhood had taught him that nature has its own rhythm, then this period of life taught him that such a rhythm can be felt not only through intuition, it can also be counted, recorded, and perceived as an order. The city of Vienna at that time was not like the quiet gardens of Moravia, nor did it bear the discrete rhythm of monastic life in Brno. It was broader, more dynamic, layered with more kinds of knowledge. There, Mendel entered a space where people did not merely contemplate the world, but also tried to name it through clearer laws. Physics, mathematics, experimental method. These things did not strip nature of its beauty, but allowed that beauty to appear with a deeper structure, as if behind the soft petals and the changing seasons, there stood an invisible skeleton of order upholding it all. For a mind like Mendel's, this must have been a very important encounter, for he was not the kind of man who needed inspiration alone. He needed a way to carry his patience and intuition farther. He had known how to observe since childhood, but now he was learning how to observe systematically. He had already known how to value small differences, but now he was learning not to let them drift away as vague impressions. In Vienna, nature gradually appeared before him, not only as a world to love, but also as a world that could be read through the carefulness of numbers. This was profoundly important because before Mendel, many people who worked with plants, species reproduction, and hybridization relied largely on experience. That experience was valuable, of course. It was the wisdom of many generations gathered in the hands and in the eyes. But experience often lives by feeling, while science asks for one step more, to turn feeling into a model, intuition into evidence, what we think to be so into something that can be clearly shown. During his years in Vienna, Mendel was learning precisely that transition, and perhaps he learned it not as an ambitious man eager to master knowledge, but as a gardener who had just been given a new kind of light with which to look more closely at the piece of ground he had always loved. We can imagine him in his classes, quieter than many others, not loud, not seeking to impress. He was not the kind of explosive genius who made everyone turn and look at once. He seems to have belonged to a slower, steadier kind of intelligence, the kind that does not flash like lightning, but is more like an oil lamp being lit little by little until, at last, it is able to shine very far. He learned not only by talent, but by endurance. He learned by accepting that there were things he did not understand immediately, and instead of turning away, he remained with them a little longer. That made Mendel deeply human, and also deeply trustworthy. For there are great minds that do not grow out of ease, but out of the habit of correcting themselves. Each stumble becomes an adjustment. Each place of uncertainty becomes a place for greater patience. Perhaps it was precisely for this reason that later, when conducting experiments, Mendel was never impatient with the slowness of nature. He had grown accustomed to learning again and again, accustomed to the fact that an answer does not arrive on the first day. A person trained in that way does not easily grow irritated when a seed germinates slowly, when the data are not yet sufficient, when a phenomenon is still tangled like threads not yet undone. Vienna also gave him another gift, a sense that the visible world is not a meaningless labyrinth. Behind complex changes, stable laws may still exist. This idea may sound simple, but in truth it is a very deep foundation. For if one does not believe that nature has order, one will not patiently go in search of it. And if one does not learn how to use the tools of thought to recognize that order, one will remain forever outside the door. Through his years in Vienna, Mendel was gradually acquiring both faith in the real existence of law and the intellectual means to draw near to it. Even so, this period should not be seen as a smooth story of academic success. Mendel did not become a radiant model of easy triumph. He remained a man who had to learn through effort, who had to carry his own limitations with him, who had to continue forward more through perseverance than through brilliance. For that reason, knowledge came to him not as a crown, but as a tool gradually sharpened in the hand over the years. And that tool would later return with him to things very small, very quiet, where seeds, flowers, and slight differences in color and form were waiting for someone patient enough, precise enough, humble enough, to see that life, too, has its own way of repeating itself. For after every lecture, every formula, every measurement, the most important thing Vienna perhaps left in Mendel was not knowledge alone. It was a way of seeing that made him understand that nature is not only beautiful to behold, but also consistent enough to be read, not only rich enough to fill human beings with wonder, but also ordered enough to invite them to think. And once the eyes have learned how to see in that way, they will no longer look at plants as they once did. They will begin to seek in every petal, every pea seed, every repetition of the seasons, something deeper than the surface, as though amid the endless variety of the world, there flickers a slender thread which, if followed long enough, a human being may one day touch. But life rarely opens its doors in a straight line. Sometimes, just as a mind has been carefully prepared to step into its work, the world places another trial before it, a refusal, a moment of not being recognized, a door that seems to close precisely when one most needs it to open. And just as many seeds do not sprout on the first day they are sown, there are destinies that only truly find their path after quietly enduring a season that has not yet been named. There are doors in life that do not open the first time we knock. There are journeys that seem to have come very close to a quiet harbor, only to suddenly veer away because of one small misstep, one failed examination, one word of affirmation that does not arrive at the right moment. For Gregor Mendel, the path toward becoming an official teacher, a path that might have brought him a clear standing, a secure position, and a sense of being recognized by society, did not open as easily as he had hoped. He entered that examination with hope, yet came away from it with an incomplete result. Seen from the outside, this was only an academic failure, but seen more slowly, more deeply, it was a profoundly human moment. For perhaps Mendel, like so many people devoted to study, had also hoped that after many years of effort, life would finally grant him a more stable place to stand. A diploma, a position, a recognition. These things are not entirely vanity. Sometimes they are simply a gentle confirmation that the road one has walked has not been in vain. And when that confirmation does not yet arrive, the human heart can hardly avoid growing a little heavy. What makes Mendel memorable is not that he never stumbled. What is memorable is the way he moved through that stumble, without noise, without indulging too much in self-pity, without turning disappointment into bitterness. He seems to have accepted it in the way of those who have long been familiar with the fact that life does not always follow their plans. A little quieter, a little slower, but not for that reason stopping altogether. Perhaps this is one of Mendel's quietest yet most precious qualities. He was not recognized early. He was not the sort of person who was applauded the moment he appeared. He was not the kind of talent immediately seen wherever he went. And that very fact, strange as it may sound, became an advantage. For those who are welcomed too early are sometimes bound by the expectations of others. But those who are not named from the very beginning often have the chance to remain longer with the rhythmist side themselves. They are less easily drawn onto the stage. They are compelled to live more deeply inside their work, rather than inside the reactions of the crowd. Mendel seems to have belonged to that kind of person. When the door of recognition did not open, he had little choice except to return to the real work, learning, observing, preparing, continuing. And sometimes it is precisely the absence of early brilliance that saves a person from being scattered. It keeps inner strength from laking away into the effort of proving oneself. It compels the mind to return to the essential question: what is it that I truly wish to understand, and toward what am I truly being called? Failure in examinations, therefore, was not merely a small scratch in Mendel's biography. It was a moment in which fate adjusted its direction. Perhaps if everything had gone more smoothly, he would have become a respected teacher, living a useful and stable life. But perhaps that very stability would have kept him from traveling farther into the very particular territory that was waiting for him. For there are some people who are not born to receive rewards too early. They are born to keep walking until they reach the door that truly belongs to them. The door that brings not only a position, but a calling. For the audience of Deep Sleep of Power, this is a pause worth reflecting upon. When people are young, they often think that early recognition is a great blessing. That is not untrue, but life, when viewed across many years, often reveals another truth, softer than that. Not everything that comes late is a misfortune. There are values that must pass through silence for a time before they are fully ripe. There are abilities that need to grow beyond the reach of bright lights in order to preserve their depth. There are seeds that, if forced to bloom too soon, may not endure. Mendel is a beautiful example of that late ripening. The rejection he received did not make him smaller. It merely caused the light within him to become less displayed and to travel deeper inward. Instead of stepping immediately onto a high platform of recognition, he continued to live in the quiet interval. And sometimes it is precisely that quiet interval that becomes the place where great thoughts are kept warm. No one forces them to take shape at once. No one applauds too early, and it makes them imagine they are already complete. They simply grow in silence like roots pressing deeper into the earth before the trunk is strong enough to stand in the wind. In truth, society is often very skilled at seeing success once it is complete, but not always skilled at recognizing a mind that is still being formed. That may be saddening, but it is also one of the familiar laws of human life. Mendel, in a certain sense, was protected by that very invisibility. It gave him time. It kept him outside the noisy realm of affirmation. And in that span of time, he gradually became the kind of person capable of doing a task that not everyone has the strength to do, remaining for a very long time beside a small question until it opens into a vast field. In the end, the most important thing is not whether Mendel passed that examination or not. The most important thing is that he did not allow a single failure to determine the full size of his soul. He did not shrink into inferiority, nor did he rush out to seize some other title merely to compensate. He continued, quietly, steadily, enduringly, and it is precisely that silent gait that makes his story so deep. One day the world would come to know his name, but not because he had passed an examination, rather, because he had been patient enough not to abandon his own path, simply because one door had closed too early. And just as in many seasons of sowing in nature, sometimes there must be a pause, a stretch of ground that seems not yet to have sprouted, before the seed can silently do its most important work beneath the dark soil. Ahead of Mendel, there still lay a stretch of life that was very quiet, yet deeply decisive. There would be no cheers of early success there, no harsh light of fame, only a garden, rows of low plants, small labels for recording observations, and a man who had finally found the work most suited to the rhythm of his own heart. The work of one who waits for nature to speak on its own, rather than forcing it to answer at once. There are discoveries that astonish the world because of their grandeur, but there are also discoveries that enter history in such a small form that if one were to pass by them, one would hardly notice. The story of Gregor Mendel belongs to the second kind. It did not begin with an observatory, did not begin with the sounds of machinery in a modern laboratory, nor did it begin with the sudden brilliance of an invention that set all of Europe abuzz. It began in a pea garden, a very ordinary garden. There was a fence. There was soft earth after the rain. There were narrow paths between the rows of plants. There were delicate white and purple blossoms that most people would only glance at and then forget. There were peas, round, wrinkled, green, yellow, things so simple that hardly anyone could believe they might hold within themselves a doorway into the secret of life. But perhaps it is precisely there that Mendel's beauty appears most clearly. He did not need a grand setting in order to begin great work. He did not wait for the world to hand him a brighter place. He took what was small, what was near, what was quiet, and remained with it long enough for greatness to slowly reveal itself. This is a very rare quality, and also a very beautiful one. The ability to believe that humble things are not small at all, if one knows how to look at them the right way. Let us slow down a little and try to picture that garden. A morning in Brno may still have held dew upon the tips of the leaves. The ground kept a trace of coolness from the night before. The air was not noisy, only marked by the distant sound of birds, the soft footsteps upon the path, the faint rustle of leaves touching one another as the wind passed by. Mendel walked among the rows like someone who had not come to conquer, but to listen. In his hands, there may have been notebooks, labels, and simple tools, but before his eyes were not the grand wonders of nature, but pea plants. And yet, as with so many great mysteries of life, what mattered was not the thing being seen, but the way of seeing. Many others had surely also seen pea plants in bloom, had seen seeds from one harvest pass into the next, had seen that children resemble their parents. But seeing a phenomenon has never been enough. What made Mendel who he was is that he did not stop at seeing. He wanted to know why. He wanted to know whether those differences repeated themselves. He wanted to know whether beneath that appearance of chance, some order was quietly at work. And when a person truly carries within himself that kind of curiosity, an ordinary garden is no longer ordinary. It becomes a book written in leaves, in flowers, in pollen, in seeds. a book that nature opens only to those patient enough to read it. It should also be said that the choice of a pea garden was not merely a convenient decision. It reflected very clearly the nature of Mendel's intellect. He did not chase after the most complicated thing simply because it looked more grand. He chose the thing best suited for a question to be answered clearly. That is the mark of someone who truly knows how to do science. Genius often lies not in searching for what is most distant, but in choosing the right place from which to ask. A pea, in the eyes of others, is only a pea. In Mendel's eyes, it was a small lock waiting for the right key. And then the work began, not with an explosion, but with repetition. Each flower was pollinated with care. Each plant was observed. Each label was recorded. Each small difference was preserved through untiring attention. There is something deeply meditative in such work. It is close to the labor of a gardener, yet also close to the silence of a contemplative. In order to do what Mendel did, one must accept the slow rhythm of life. One cannot urge a seed to sprout more quickly. One cannot force a season to arrive sooner. One cannot demand that nature answer today simply because one wishes it so. Here, science appears not as a race, but as an art of waiting. Perhaps that is exactly what makes Mendel's story so fitting for deep sleep of power. Power in his world did not lie in a loud voice, did not lie in rank, nor did it lie in forcing nature to bow. His power lay somewhere deeper, in the ability to sit still before something small without despising it, in the ability to repeat one action through many seasons without growing discouraged, in the ability to believe that truth does not need to be noisy in order to be true. For Mendel, science did not begin with display. It began with the endurance of attention. And perhaps that is why the garden is so beautiful in our imagination today. It was not merely the place where a few experiments on plants took place. It was the place where a quiet man tried to prove that life is not a stream wholly without clarity, that beneath its seemingly endless variety, there may still be stable rhythms that the world, which the naked eye sees as a painting of many colors, may also contain discrete lines repeating themselves from one generation to the next. But to read that picture, patience alone was not enough, nor was a garden alone enough. One also had to choose the right language through which nature could speak more clearly. And Mendel, after stepping into the garden, after placing his hands upon the slow rhythm of the seasons, would soon realize that among the many kinds of plants, there was one species especially willing to cooperate with him more than the others, as though nature itself knew that some secrets should reveal themselves only through the simplest forms. In the history of science, people often praise great discoveries with very radiant words: genius, revolution, foundation, origin. But if we move a little more slowly, we will see that behind many great discoveries, there is not always a dazzling moment. Sometimes, what proves decisive lies instead in a far quieter act, choosing the right place to begin. With Gregor Mendel, his genius lay not only in his patience, nor only in his ability to record and reason, but also in something very subtle. He chose the right plant through which nature could speak more clearly, and that plant was the pea plant. It sounds so simple, almost too simple. When we hear of a man who helped lay the foundations of genetics, we easily imagine more complicated things: strange organisms, delicate instruments, mysterious research rooms. But Mendel bent down before a plant that countless farmers had long been accustomed to seeing. It is precisely here that the beauty of his intellect becomes so clear. He did not seek greatness by way of a grand appearance. He sought clarity. The pea plant, first of all, was a very practical choice. It was easy to grow. It did not require an overly special environment. It grew quickly enough for one person to observe it across many seasons and many generations without having to wait as long as one would with perennial plants. It also had several quite distinct traits: round or wrinkled seeds, green or yellow, flowers of different colors, tall plants or short ones. These traits were not vague. They were distinct enough for the human eye to recognize, stable enough for the observer to follow, and simple enough that change would not be lost in too much noise. But if that were all, someone else might also have done what Mendel did. What made this choice special was that he did not merely see the pea plant as convenient. He saw it as a fitting language. Nature has countless ways of expressing itself, but not all of them are equally clear to human beings. There are plants, traits, and changes so complex, so interwoven, that the law behind them is obscured, like writing traced upon the surface of water. Mendel seems to have understood that if one truly wishes to hear clearly, one must first find a place where the voice of nature is least entangled with noise. That is the quality of one who knows how to ask the right question. Not to ask loudly, not to ask endlessly, but to ask in the right place. Many people had seen plants grow, had seen children resemble their parents, had marveled at the return of a trait that seemed to have disappeared. But not everyone paused to ask, how can that wonder be turned into a question that can be tested? How can one choose a subject through which that question has a real chance of being answered clearly? And how can one keep from being enchanted by complexity so as to begin with what is as simple as possible? Mendel was able to do exactly that. Put another way, he did not stand before nature as someone lost in formless fascination. He stood before it like someone who knew how to listen selectively. He understood that in that garden, not every plant was equally suited to reveal the secret of life. Some were more closed. Some traits were too deeply mixed. Some lines of change were too difficult to trace. But the pea plant was different. It was like a book written in a slightly clearer hand, so that one who was patient enough would not merely admire the cover, but would truly read what was inside. This may sound purely scientific, yet in truth it is very close to human life. So often wisdom does not lie in trying to solve everything at once. It lies in knowing how to choose one small but correct point from which to begin, in knowing how to find the clearest thread and follow it, rather than trying to grasp the whole spool while everything is still tangled. Mendel did precisely that with nature. He did not try to seize the whole secret of life at the very beginning. He chose one small plant, a few clear traits, and a path narrow enough to be walked all the way through. And sometimes it is precisely that humility that opens the greatest door. Here, Mendel's genius was not the brilliance of a mind seeking to prove itself superior. It was the precision of a mind that knew what it needed. He did not choose the pea plant because it was more beautiful than other plants. He chose it because it allowed the truth to be less obscured. That is the sign of science in its purest form, not searching for what makes oneself appear intelligent, but searching for what makes the problem itself clearer. And when we think of that in the gentle slowness of tonight, Mendel's story suddenly carries a very deep meaning. Perhaps in the life of every human being, it is much the same. Very often we grow tired, not because the world is too mysterious, but because we have not yet chosen the right question to ask of it. We stand before too many large things, too many complicated things, too many tangled things, and forget that sometimes truth reveals itself only when we are calm enough to begin with something very small, very clear, very near. That is how Mendel bent down before the pea plant, not with contempt, but with a quiet reverence, for he knew that the small is not small at all if it is holding the key to the great. And from that point onward, his garden was no longer merely a garden. It became a place where each small difference in color, form, and height began to have its own voice. A place where each passing season brought not only plants and seeds, but signs that were slowly coming into clearer view. But choosing the right question was only the beginning. After that, there still remained a longer work, steadier work, and quieter work. One had to count, to record, to wait, to travel with the passing seasons long enough to know whether what one sensed was truly a law, or only a passing chance that had crossed the garden on a misty morning. There are people who enter history through a dazzling moment, but there are also people who enter history through a sequence of days that are almost identical, so quiet that from a distance one sees only a life that seems entirely ordinary. With Gregor Mendel, the greatest beauty of those years did not lie in a single flash of revelation, but in his capacity to endure the slowness of nature. He did not drag the law into the light with one sudden pull. He simply remained long enough, steadily enough, faithfully enough, for the law to step forward on its own. In the monastery garden, everything seemed to unfold in a very small rhythm. One season followed another. Flowers bloomed and then faded. Fruit formed. Seeds ripened. The pea plants were selected, marked, crossbred, and then observed again in the next generation. Outwardly, there was nothing dramatic about this work. No loud sounds, no splendid spectacle. There was only a man walking among the rows of plants with his notebook, his labels, and an attention that seemed almost untiring. But it is precisely here that we begin to see Mendel's true quality. Many people are curious about nature. Few are patient enough to remain with that curiosity for many years. For science, at its deepest level, is not only about asking questions. It is also about accepting that the answer may come very slowly. It may not come on a beautiful morning. It may not come in the first growing season. It may require hundreds of observations, thousands of counts, many columns of numbers that seem dry at first glance, before the delicate but certain shape of truth begins to appear. Mendel lived exactly within that rhythm. He counted. He counted the plants that bore this trait. He counted the plants that bore that trait. He counted the round seeds, the wrinkled seeds, the tall plants, the short plants, the flowers of this color and of that color. Those numbers, if taken separately, may seem cold, but in Mendel's hands, they were not lifeless at all. They were the tiny footprints of a law. Each number was like a soft knock from nature upon the door of human understanding. One knock alone says little, but many knocks, repeating themselves in a certain order, slowly become a rhythm. He recorded. He recorded not only in order to remember, but in order not to be deceived by intuition. Human memory often keeps what is unusual and forgets what is repeated. And yet it is precisely in repetition that law resides. Mendel understood this. He did not allow fleeting impressions to guide him. He preserved each detail on paper, as though fearing that if he did not, nature would drift away once more into its own beautiful vagueness, leaving no clear shape for the mind to hold on to. And then he waited. Waiting is a very gentle word, But in Mendel's case, it was a great power. Waiting was not sitting still in passivity. Waiting meant continuing to do his work faithfully when the result had not yet become clear. Waiting meant accepting the passing of seasons while still being unable to say with certainty whether what he sensed was true or not. Waiting meant not rushing to declare, not forcing nature to answer according to his own wishes, not turning a few early signs into truth simply because he wanted them so badly to be true. This is exactly why Mendel's story is so beautiful in the world of deep sleep of power, for his power was not the kind of power we usually see. It did not lie in the ability to impose, but in the ability to make room for truth to appear in its own time. He did not stand above nature and command it. He bent down beside it, like one who knew how to listen. And in an age when human beings often want to know quickly, conclude quickly, and publish quickly, Mendel did the opposite. He allowed time itself to become part of the method. Perhaps that is why these years, though outwardly so quiet, were the deepest part of his life. A great mind is measured not only by what it can think, but also by what it can endure. Mendel endured repetition. He endured the outward monotony of the work. He endured the feeling that he was doing something very small, while no one could guarantee where it would lead. And it was precisely that endurance that gave him his stature. For there are great truths that do not come to those who look quickly. They come to those who look long enough. There are laws that do not reveal themselves before anxious eyes. They take shape only for those calm enough to return to the same patch of earth, the same question, the same gesture, season after season. Mendel lived in exactly that way. He did not go searching for miracles. He was simply so steadfast that what others called chance began to grow tired of repeating itself before his eyes so many times, and at last it revealed its true face. It was not chance, but order. There is an almost meditative beauty in this. Amid the countless changes of human life, Mendel chose a kind of work whose fruit did not lie in excitement, but in steadiness. That is something very soothing for the mind of the listener tonight. It reminds us that some of the most important things in life are not built through great leaps, but through humble rhythms of repetition. A prayer spoken each day, a good habit kept long enough, an observation that does not give up, a faith quietly sustained. From such things, larger structures slowly begin to appear. And then after so many acts of counting, so many pages of notes, so many seasons of waiting, a vague feeling began to condense. The numbers were no longer merely scattered numbers. They began to lean toward one another, to call to one another, to form a shape. Like mist slowly lifting over a field, what had once been only a blur now began to emerge in clearer lines. Mendel began to see that certain traits did not disappear, as people had assumed. They simply withdrew into a quiet interval and waited for another moment to return. And once that began to appear, the pea garden was no longer merely a place of flowers and seeds. It became a place where life whispered its first secret. The secret that in this world there are things that fall silent, but do not vanish. After many silent seasons of peas following one another, after acts of counting so patient that time itself seemed to slow down and move beside him, Gregor Mendel at last saw something that most people before him had only sensed vaguely, but had not yet been able to name with clarity. It was a discovery, not noisy like thunder or lightning. It came more like the early mist over a field gradually thinning, until the distant rows of trees slowly came into view. Not suddenly, but firmly enough for one to know that one is seeing something real. Mendel realized that when he crossed plants bearing two different traits, the result in the first generation was not always a faint blending, as many people might have imagined. On the contrary, one trait would often appear clearly, while the other seemed to vanish from sight. A round pea could overshadow a wrinkled one. One flower color could appear in full view, while the other receded into shadow. If one looked quickly, one might think that one of the two traits had been erased, defeated, or eliminated. But Mendel was not someone who looked quickly. He looked longer than that, and because he looked longer, he saw something more secret. The other trait had not disappeared. It had only fallen silent. That is a very beautiful idea, and a very deep one as well. In Mendel's world, life was not a place where things appeared and vanished in a chaotic flow. There were things that receded and yet remained there. There were things that did not show themselves immediately before our eyes, and yet still quietly continued within life, waiting for another moment to return. Mendel saw this through pea plants, but what he touched seems to have reached far beyond his garden. He touched a gentle order within nature. Nature does not forget as quickly as the human eye tends to imagine. Today, we are familiar with words like dominant and recessive, and so it is easy to forget that in Mendel's time, seeing this was a major step. For if a trait does not appear in the offspring, people naturally tend to believe that it has disappeared entirely. That way of thinking is close to intuition, close to the naked eye, close to the simple impressions of everyday life. But Mendel, through his numbers and his patience, stepped beyond intuition. He realized that what the eye does not see is not necessarily gone. And this is precisely where his science becomes both exact and deeply reflective. We might put it in a very plain way like this. Within life, there are things that prefer to stand in the front, and there are also things that know how to step behind. But stepping behind does not mean leaving the stage. It simply means waiting. Waiting for another combination, waiting for another union, waiting for another season in the stream of inheritance. Mendel was the first to see that this waiting was not aimless. It had a law, and once something has a law, it is no longer a miracle. It becomes knowledge. This is what makes Mendel's work so special. He did not merely record a phenomenon. He did something more difficult. He showed that behind the phenomenon there was a structure. A trait was not simply stronger in some vague sense. It appeared according to a pattern repeated steadily enough for human beings to trust that nature was not throwing dice. Beneath the diversity of plants, beneath all the forms, colors, heights, wrinklings, and roundnesses of seeds and flowers, there was a discrete framework holding life to rhythms more consistent than people had once imagined. Perhaps that is why this discovery carries a beauty so fitting to the spirit of deep sleep of power. Mendel's power did not lie in making nature become something else. His power lay in being quiet enough to hear what nature was whispering. Many people move through life believing that what does not appear before their eyes has been lost. But Mendel, with his pea plants and his pages of notes, seems to offer a gentler reminder. There are things that are only temporarily retreating into shade. If we think a little more broadly, this is not only the story of peas. It also touches the way human beings understand life itself. In every family, every lineage, every generation, we often encounter features that seem to have disappeared, only to suddenly return one day in a face, in a way of walking, in a smile, in a sensitivity, in some very small habit. Before Mendel, such things were often seen merely as interesting accidents of life. After Mendel, they began to rest on a new foundation. They were no longer just stories. They were traces of a silent, enduring law flowing through many generations. And from this point onward, Mendel's story began to move beyond the monastery garden. For once, human beings understood that a trait does not vanish, but may sink out of sight and then return. They had opened the first door into a much larger room. That room held questions about how traits travel together, how they separate, how they combine, how, from a few single differences, an entire living world of endless forms can be woven. The first law appeared like a small lamp just lit. Its light did not yet illuminate the whole room, but it was enough to show that in the darkness ahead, there were still other outlines waiting to be named. Mendel must have felt that in his own way, not with too loud a cry of triumph, but perhaps with a deeper stillness within. A person who has waited a long time does not rush when what he has been waiting for finally appears. He simply leans a little closer, looks a little more carefully, and understands that if the first law has revealed itself, then behind it, there are very likely other doors as well. Doors leading deeper into the order, hidden beneath the apparent randomness of life, where not only a single trait, but many traits at once are also quietly obeying rhythms of their own. When the first door opens, people usually have two choices. They may either remain standing for a long time in the light that has just appeared and feel satisfied that they have seen enough, or they may step farther inside, where the darkness is still thicker, but for that very reason may be hiding greater things. Gregor Mendel seems to have chosen the second path. After realizing that some traits do not disappear but merely retreat into silence, he did not stop at the joy of a single discovery. He continued farther, deeper, and began to ask himself, if one trait follows such a law, then what happens when many traits appear at once? Is life still only a beautiful but unpredictable picture? Or beneath those overlapping lines, is there still a discrete order keeping rhythm for everything? That question, if we think carefully about it, is a very large one. In real life, we rarely see only one isolated trait. A pea plant does not have only seed color. It also has seed shape, flower, color, stem height, pod form, and many other small nuances that the human eye can recognize. Just as a person does not carry only one feature resembling the parents, but an entire bundle of traits woven together: face, gait, eye color, voice, temperament. It is precisely that layering which makes life seem endlessly rich, and also very random. People easily say, being born looking like the father or the mother is a matter of chance, an unpredictable accident, a coin toss of creation. But Mendel no longer looked at life through the eyes of chance. He had begun to suspect that what people called randomness might only be an order too subtle for the ordinary eye to see. And so he continued the same work, in the same way, counting, recording, comparing, waiting. Only now the object of observation was no longer a single thread, but many threads being woven together at once. The work was harder, more complex. It demanded from Mendel not only patience, but also a very particular calmness of intellect, calmness in the face of confusion. There are people who, when standing before too much data, too much variation, too many possibilities, quickly conclude that everything is chaos. But Mendel seems not to have feared complexity. He simply slowed down even more, like a person untangling threads, not with haste, but with fingers gentle enough to do it well. What he gradually saw was marvelous in a very quiet way. When many traits were observed together, life did not collapse into obscurity. On the contrary, behind that richness, there were still repeating patterns. There were still proportions, tendencies, and combinations that were not entirely arbitrary. Put very simply, nature does not throw the traits of parents into the next generation like something scattered by a capricious wind. It works with far more principles than that. Traits may travel together, separate, and then appear again in different combinations, but they do not dance meaninglessly. Somewhere beneath the surface, a discrete rhythm is guiding them. It is here that Mendel's stature begins to appear even more clearly. He did not merely observe that one plant differed from another. He did not merely say that there were dominant traits and recessive traits. He laid the foundation for an idea far deeper than that. Life can be read through law. Today that may sound familiar, but in his time, it was a great step. It meant that things people had long thought could only be observed with wonder and then left to mystery were now beginning to enter a brighter region, a region where reason could follow them, not in order to destroy the beauty of nature, but to understand that beauty itself was not without structure. There is a very particular beauty in this discovery, for Mendel did not make the world less wondrous. He only made that wonder less obscure. Before him, resemblance and difference across generations were like a fairy tale of nature, deeply fascinating, yet difficult to grasp. After him, that story began to take on the form of a piece of music, still gentle, still varied, still holding moments that surprise us. But behind it, now there was rhythm, there was measure. There were repeated passages sufficient for us to know that this was not the sound of pure improvisation, but of a deeper structure resonating underneath. For the audience of Deep Sleep of Power, this may be one of Mendel's most beautiful layers of meaning. He teaches us that true order does not always appear on the surface. There are forms of order that are very quiet, very fine, almost invisible if we stand too far away or move too quickly. Just as in a family, sometimes only after many years do we suddenly notice a way of sitting like a grandfather's, a way of being silent like a mother's, a smile like that of a grandmother who passed away long ago. Life is like that too, full of details that seem scattered, but if we love enough, slow down enough, remain patient enough, we begin to see that they are not as scattered as they first appeared. Mendel lived with that slowness. He did not rush into life like a hunter. He sat beside it like someone recording the changing light upon the surface of a lake. With each passing season, he gained a little more certainty. With each new generation of plants, he saw more clearly that he was not only growing peas, but also cross-breeding them. He was standing before a truth greater than his garden itself, that within the seemingly limitless diversity of the organic world, there are laws quiet, enduring, and reliable enough that human beings can build from them an entirely new understanding of life. But truth, however beautiful it may be, is not always welcomed by the world the moment it appears. Some discoveries enter life like dawn, at first very faint, noticed by very few, and even turned away from by many because they are not yet accustomed to that kind of light. And Mendel, the man who had read part of the hidden structure beneath life, would also come to taste another kind of silence, the silence of a work that was right, yet had not yet found the right ears to hear it. There are seeds which, once sown, need only one timely rain to sprout very quickly. But there are also seeds that lie for a very long time beneath the soil, quietly enduring the cold, the darkness, the forgetfulness of the surface, before some fitting season at last calls them to awaken. The work of Gregor Mendel seems to have belonged to the second kind. He has seen part of the hidden structure beneath life. He had patiently counted, recorded, waited, and then from tiny pea seeds, built a new way of understanding how traits are passed on. But when he brought that work before the world did not immediately stop to listen. This is one of the sad paradoxes that history repeats again and again. A person may touch something very great, very true, very deep, yet his age may not yet have ears enough to hear it. Not because the thing lacks value, but because there are truths that arrive too early for the preparedness of the world around them. Mendel presented the results of his research before a local scientific society in Brno, and later had the work printed under a modest title, one that almost seemed to have no desire to display itself. Looking back with the eyes of today, we know that he was standing very near a great threshold in the history of science. But at that time, the light of that threshold was still too faint. It was not strong enough to make the crowd turn its head. The work was printed, sent out, and placed into the world, yet it did not create a wave. There were no cries of celebration, no major debates arose at once. There was no feeling that humanity had just been handed a new key for understanding itself. And perhaps this happened not only because people were indifferent. Partly, it was also because science at that time was not truly ready. Mendel's thinking was too clear in a place where the world was still accustomed to thinking in more ambiguous ways. He used numbers to read life, while many others were still looking at life through intuition, through scattered experience, through impressions not yet formed into a system. In other words, Mendel not only went further than others, he also traveled by a path that not many people of his time knew how to follow. This gives his story a very particular loneliness. Not the loneliness of a man driven away or fiercely attacked, but a loneliness quieter even than that. The loneliness of a man speaking the truth into a room not yet still enough to hear, or not yet furnished with enough language to fully understand. There are great sorrows that do not come from opposition, but from silence. Mendel seems to have encountered exactly that kind of silence. But it is precisely here that his character appears even more deeply. He did not turn the world's indifference into a performance of grievance. He did not pound more loudly upon the door of recognition. He did not make himself into a man demanding that history immediately restore justice to him. He seems to have accepted that quietness in the manner of one who had lived long enough with plants to understand that not every season is a season of harvest. There are things in life that must be done because they are right, not because they will be praised at once. This is what makes Mendel so fitting for older audiences, and so fitting as well for the spirit of deep sleep of power. For after a certain age, people begin to understand a truth gentler than youth often allows. Real value does not always arrive with applause at the right moment. There are people who spend their entire lives off the stage and still leave behind a greater influence than many who once stood in the light. There are kinds of work done in silence, not viral, not noisy, not immediately praised, and yet it is precisely these that endure. If we use a very modern language to speak about Mendel, we might say that he was the kind of genius who did not go viral. But behind that half-playful phrase lies a very deep truth. The culture of the crowd tends to react strongly to whatever is bright, new, strange, and easy to retell. Mendel's work, by contrast, belonged to another kind of beauty, the beauty of precision, of patience, of quiet order. It did not explode like fireworks. It was more like an oil lamp placed in the corner of a room. Only those calm enough to remain seated would notice that its light was making the whole room easier to see. We should also remember that Mendel was not the only person in history to pass through such a dark interval. Many great ideas were initially met by the world with indifference. This is not always because the world is cruel. Very often, people have simply lived too long inside older frames of understanding. A new idea, before it can enter the minds of others, must first wait for the ground to soften. It must wait for other questions to arise. It must wait for the surrounding pieces to shift just enough so that what was once seen as too early may one day become indispensable. Seen in that light, the silence surrounding Mendel was not only a sorrow, it was also part of a larger story, the story of the timing of knowledge. There are discoveries that do not belong to the rhythm of a single lifetime. The one who sows only sows. It is those who come later who see the forest. And at this point, Mendel becomes even more beautiful. For even without being fully seen, his work still possessed enough quality to go on living. It did not need exaggeration in order to endure. It only needed to be placed rightly into the world. The rest of the time would do just as a good seed does not need to shout about its power to germinate. It only needs to preserve its life within. Then, in some season, the soil will remember it. Perhaps Mendel lived the years that followed in something like that spirit, not unaware of the silence around him, yet not entirely broken by it either. His life would gradually shift into another rhythm, heavier with responsibility, busier with work, farther from the clear freedom of those old seasons among the pea plants. And like many people who have once touched the very fine order of nature, he would have to learn how to continue onward within another kind of order, the order of ledgers, duties, organization, and burdens that do not bloom, yet still demand the full strength of a human life. There are lives that enter their deepest phase, not when they are free of burdens, but when they are called into heavier responsibilities. And there are also minds which, after a long stretch of living with the most delicate questions of intellect, must turn back to face the very real, very heavy, and very unpoetic matters of organized life. With Gregor Mendel, his later years carried exactly that tone. The man who had once quietly bent over rows of peas, who had once heard the hidden rhythm of life through tiny seeds, eventually had to rise and take on another role. Abbot. At first hearing, that sounds like an honorable advancement, and indeed, it was. A man placed in such a position could not be an ordinary one. That office required trustworthiness, stability, maturity, and the ability to keep a community moving through the steady rhythms of monastic life and the unceasing demands of reality. Mendel entered that role not with great noise, but as with everything else in his life, quietly, earnestly, and with a certain humility. But behind that solemn dignity lay a very deep redirection of fate. For from this point onward, his life no longer belonged to those long stretches of stillness as it once had. A monastery is not only a place for prayer, reading, and contemplation. It is also a living organism with finances, personnel, paperwork, obligations, relations with authorities, conflicts that must be resolved, and matters that contain very little poetry yet cannot be ignored. On Mendel's shoulders now rested not only the intellect of a researcher, but also the burden of someone who had to keep a collective order from falling apart. His days gradually filled with ledgers, letters, decisions, and anxieties. And within that filling up, another space was perhaps quietly narrowing. The space once reserved for the garden, for experiments, for the familiar slowness of observation. This is a very quiet sorrow of adult life. It is not the sorrow of failure, nor is it exactly the sorrow of having something one loves taken away. It is closer to the feeling of a river gradually changing course because new banks have begun to form around it. The water still flows, life still goes on, and outwardly, everything may even appear steadier than before. But the one living through it knows that the old rhythm has changed. The long hours once belonging to thought must now be divided among responsibilities. The quiet regions that once nourished an idea are now broken into pieces by duty. And a life of research, if it does not entirely stop, begins at least to enter a phase of gradual quieting. Mendel must have felt that very clearly, not because science had abandoned him, but because life no longer allowed him to belong wholly to science as he once had. This makes his story deeper and also more familiar to many people. In life, not everyone is allowed to remain forever with what they love most. Many people eventually reach a point when they must leave their private sky behind in order to shoulder work that is less luminous but more necessary. Some must care for family, some must worry about their livelihood, some must bear collective responsibility, and in that process, a very private part of them does not go out entirely, but is compelled to retreat behind the scenes, like a lamp still burning low in a room that no longer belongs wholly to the silent night. In Mendel, this took on an especially particular shade, for he was a man who had once touched a very subtle order in nature. He had lived with questions that, if one only leaned a little closer, waited one more season, counted one more column of numbers, might allow the world to open with greater clarity. But then, instead of continuing far along that path, he had to turn toward another kind of order, the order of institutions, administration, taxation, and the frictions between religious life and government. In particular, the disputes involving taxes and the rights of the Monastery consumed no small amount of Mendel's energy. This was no longer the gentle dialogue with nature. This was a far harder terrain, where human beings do not respond with the evenly repeated laws of pea plants, but with power, conflict, procedure, and the tensions of society. For a mind accustomed to living with the kindly precision of nature, this must have been a deeply uncomfortable shift. And yet, it is precisely here that we see another kind of beauty in Mendel. The beauty of a man who not only knew how to think great things, but also knew how to bear heavy ones. He did not flee responsibility in order to preserve a private purity for himself. He entered that dimmer phase of life with all his seriousness. That did not make him less great. On the contrary, it made his portrait fuller. A person worthy of respect is measured not only by what he discovers, but also by the way he endures the part of life that no longer belongs to discovery. For the audience of deep sleep, of power, this is a passage especially worth dwelling on. After a certain age, people begin to understand that true power does not always lie in moments of radiance. Very often it lies in the ability to preserve one's dignity when life becomes heavy, repetitive, administrative, even dry. That kind of power makes no loud sound. It is quieter than that. It is the act of continuing to live uprightly amid circumstances that no longer resemble one's original dream. Mendel lived that part of his life in exactly that way. Perhaps the garden was no longer the center of each day for him. Perhaps the crosses, the columns of numbers, the scientific intuitions were no longer able to continue with the same freedom they once had. But what he had once seen in the seed did not disappear. It merely withdrew into a quieter region of his life, much like the recessive traits he himself had once discovered, not visible before the eyes every day, yet never truly gone. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful sorrows in this story. The man who explained how things can fall silent and yet still remain, then came to live through such a phase himself, a phase in which the scientific voice within him grew quieter on the surface. But in the deeper layers, the seed he had planted still retained all its life. Only its season had not yet come. The world still did not fully understand him. The old garden was still there, but the gaze of humanity had not yet turned back long enough to see what had once begun to grow there. And then one day, when the sower had already gone farther away from his own field, those who came after would finally begin to bend down. They would turn back to the old pages, look again in their imagination at the old rows of peas, and realize that some of the greatest harvests do not come in the lifetime of the one who sowed, but much later. When time itself has finally learned how to read slowly what one quiet human being once wrote into the heart of life. There are lives that come to a close, while the world around them remains fairly quiet, as if nothing truly great has just passed by. There is no alarm bell of history, no sense that a door has just closed behind an era. There is only a human being quietly departing from life, while the everyday tasks of the world continue as before. Gregor Mendel seems to have departed in such an atmosphere. He died without fully seeing the true magnitude of what he had done. If we think carefully about that, it carries a sorrow both very deep and very gentle. For Mendel was not a man who lived in order to demand glory. He did not build his work as a platform from which to stand higher than others. He simply worked patiently, recorded patiently, and waited patiently for nature to speak on its own. However humble a person may be, there must still have been within him some deeply human place that hoped that what he had seen would one day be understood, not in order to be celebrated, but so that the truth would not have to remain alone in silence for too long. And yet during Mendel's lifetime, that did not happen. The pages he left behind were still there. The numbers were still there. The careful observations were still there. Even that pea garden, in a certain sense, still remained intact within every line he had written. But the world at that time continued to pass by without bending down closely enough. Perhaps because science, like plant life, has its own seasons. A true seed, if it falls when the ground is not yet ready, may lie still for a very long time, not because it is weak, but because its time has not yet come. Then the years passed. Others continued to study life, species, and the ways traits are passed from one generation to the next. And little by little, as science began to ask the very questions Mendel had asked before them, as experimental thought and biology moved closer to the terrain through which he had once labored alone, people began to return. They returned to the old papers. They returned to the name that had once been so faint. They returned to the garden that had seemed to sleep in oblivion. And then something remarkable happened. The world realized that it had missed something very great. It was perhaps not a dramatic moment on the stage, but it carried a very deep resonance in the history of knowledge. For what Mendel had written was not merely a few notes about pea plants. It was a foundation. It was the first framework of a new way of understanding heredity. It was a small lamp, lit in advance, but at that time, the room had not yet been dark enough for people to realize how precious that light was. There is something deeply moving in this image. Those who came later, no less intelligent, no less diligent, ultimately still had to go back in search of a man already gone in order to understand that the door they were opening today had in fact first been left ajar long ago. History is often like that. It does not always move forward in a straight line. Very often it must turn back. It must bend down. It must apologize in silence to a person whose own age did not know how to listen long enough. In Mendel's case, that return is even more beautiful because it is so fitting to what he himself had discovered. He had shown that some traits do not disappear. They only recede for a time and wait for another moment to reappear. And his own work lived in exactly that way. It did not vanish. It merely withdrew for a time. Then, when conditions had become right, it returned, not as a faint echo, but as the foundation of an entirely new scientific field. From that point onward, the pea garden in Brno was no longer merely a small patch of earth belonging to a monastery. In the memory of humanity, it became a symbol. Not splendid like a palace, not overwhelming like an observatory, but possessing a greatness all its own. There, a nearly unknown man had opened the path that would lead to modern genetics. From round and wrinkled peas, from the colors of flowers and the shapes of pods, the current of knowledge would eventually flow outward into medicine, agriculture, molecular biology, and even the way human beings understand themselves. This is where Mendel's story becomes especially deep for the audience of Deep Sleep of Power, for it reminds us of a truth both sad and consoling. Not every seed sprouts in the season of the one who sowed it. Some of the things we do today will only be fully understood by those who come after us. Some contributions are not received at the right moment, but that does not make them any smaller. On the contrary, sometimes it is precisely that quiet interval which reveals more clearly the endurance of true value. Whatever needs applause in order to survive usually does not live very long. But what continues to live even after being forgotten for a time is often what has deeper roots. Mendel left the world with exactly such a legacy, unshowy, unnoisy, yet enduring. Enduring like a seed lying still in the earth through winter without dying. Enduring like a truth that can wait for humanity to mature enough to understand it. Enduring like the thin light of dawn, which at first seems fragile, and yet quietly comes to take the whole sky. And when we think of that, we suddenly see that Mendel's story is no longer only the story of the 19th century. It begins to move softly toward our own present, a present in which human beings can look deeply into genes, read the invisible blueprints of the body, intervene in seeds, in disease, in the very things that once lay beyond the reach of an entire age. The old garden in Brno, which seems so far away, turns out still to be quietly casting its shadow over the world today. And beneath that gentle shade, a new question waits to be opened. Now that human beings can read more deeply into life, will they use that knowledge to care for it more gently, or to go too far beyond the humility that a certain monk once carried with him among the silent rows of peas? Let the breath slow a little, slow like the lamp in the room being turned down by one more small notch, still bright enough for us to see the way, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to stay awake too long with the hurried movements of the world. Breathe in, as if inviting stillness to enter. Breathe out, as if gently seeing the weariness of a long day out through the door, so that in this room there remains only an even breath, a soft darkness, and the story of a monk who once bent over tiny peas and touched one of the deepest secrets of life. And now, as the story of Gregor Mendel has nearly completed its circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age. An age very bright, very fast, very full of data. an age in which human beings can look inside their own bodies in ways the ancients would never have dared to dream. Reading genetic signs, tracing the risk of illness from a very early stage, understanding why a child carries the mother's eyes yet the grandfather's smile, why an illness can pass through many generations like a quiet echo that has never truly disappeared. Today, what Mendel saw in the monastery garden has unfolded into an entire world. From peas that were round and wrinkled, green and yellow, humanity has moved toward genetic testing, personalized medicine, the breeding of better crops to feed more people, and the hope of healing inherited diseases that once left so many families with no choice but to endure in silence. It is no exaggeration to say that wherever people today try to read the invisible blueprints of life, the shadow of Mendel is still faintly present there. But perhaps the deepest thing Mendel leaves to the year 2026 is not only a scientific foundation. He leaves us an attitude. In our age, knowledge is arriving very quickly, faster than the breath, faster than many people's ability to reflect. We may know more than our ancestors ever knew, but knowing more does not always mean understanding more deeply. And deep understanding does not automatically lead to wisdom. Mendel reminds us that the greatest secrets of life do not open themselves to the noisiest person, nor to the most impatient one. They open themselves to the person slow enough to observe, steadfast enough to wait, and humble enough not to mistake power for omniscience. That is the first lesson. The second lesson is gentler, but perhaps more necessary than ever. Small things can hold immense structures. A pea seed seems to be of no great significance, and yet it opened the path to the whole science of genetics. A slight difference in a flower petal could lead to a great change in the way humanity understands the transmission of traits across generations. In a world accustomed to chasing what is large, fast, and attention-grabbing, Mendel calls us back to the small. Do not despise subtle signs. Do not look down on quiet things. Do not imagine that whatever makes no noise has no power. Often what shapes the future is not an explosion. It is a silent law that has always been there, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. And then there is one more lesson, one especially fitting for tonight, especially fitting for listeners resting in silence. Not everything that falls silent is truly lost. Mendel once saw traits recede and then return. That is true not only of peas. It is also true of human life in a very gentle sense. There are qualities in a family that seem to have faded away, only to come alive again in another generation. There are seeds of kindness planted in one lifetime that do not sprout until much later. There are works, like Mendel's own work, that are forgotten by the world for a time, and then recognized as foundational. And perhaps the same is true within each of us. There are good parts of ourselves that have not disappeared, but are only resting in some quiet place, waiting for the right season to return. In the year 2026, when human beings are able to intervene ever more deeply in life itself, editing genes, selecting embryos, altering species, optimizing the body, extending lifespan, Mendel's story becomes all the more important, not to prevent us from learning, nor to make us afraid of science, but to remind us that understanding the invisible blueprint of the human being is a great power, and every great power must be accompanied by self-restraint. Science is at its most beautiful, not when it proves that human beings can do everything. Science is at its most beautiful when it makes human beings wise enough to know how far to go and compassionate enough to know where to stop. Mendel, through the whole of his life, seems to have said that very softly. He was not a man who loved display. He did not stand before nature as a conqueror. He stood before it as a very patient student, and perhaps that is precisely why he saw what others missed. For life does not like to be commanded. It only gradually opens itself to the one who knows how to bend low enough. So if tonight, amid the rhythm of modern life, we wish to carry something from Mendel with us into sleep, perhaps it is this. The world is woven not only from things that can be seen, but also from invisible blueprints, quietly at work beneath the surface. And for human beings to live gently within such a world, they must not only become more intelligent, but also more gentle before what they do not yet fully understand. For in the end, the strangest thing about Mendel may not only be that he helped explain why children resemble their parents. Stranger still is that from a very quiet garden, he taught all humanity that even within the smallest seeds, life is holding a greater order than its outward appearance could ever suggest. And as the lamp in the room dims a little more, as this story too slowly settles into the soft darkness of late night, perhaps we may leave one final thought resting within ourselves. Light as a pea seed, lying quietly in the soil. The deepest power is not forcing life to obey us, but being humble enough to understand the law that is quietly at work within it. And from there, sleep may come like a garden at night, still, deep, and gentle, where small things continue growing in silence.